Hi. Sorry. Welcome to Anderson Ranch and our summer's faculty series. My name is Joanne Sangwon Lee. I'm the studio coordinator of ceramics. I am very, very thrilled that we'll be hearing from both Luke Hammond-Thomas and Lane Preston tonight. I want to welcome our virtual participants watching tonight, as well as our Board of Trustees and National Council. Thank you for your support. Before we begin, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I would also like to remind everyone that there won't be any campus-wide orientation tomorrow. Please go to your studio to get studio orientations from your coordinators. I want to start by recognizing that the Anderson Ranch campus resides on a traditional ancestral territory of Ute people who called the Roaring Fork Valley and beyond home for over 800 years. Through our missions to promote a wide range of arts, cultures, and voices, we commit to partner with and honor the indigenous ancestors and residents of this sacred land where we learn, work, and create. Tonight's program will consist of 2 faculty lectures, followed by Q&A. First, it's a pleasure to introduce Luke Hammond-Thomas. Luke Toshiro Hammond-Thomas is a ceramic artist based in Brooklyn, New York. He currently works as a director of ceramics at Tom Sachs Studio and is part of the faculty at Greenwich House Pottery and Brooklyn Clay. He holds a BFA in Fine Arts from Alfred University. Please join me in welcoming Luke.
Hey everybody, how's it going? All right, perfect. So hey, I'm Luke. I'm a ceramic artist. I was born and raised in New York City with like a very, sort of like hereditary artistic background. Like my mom was an artist, my dad used to be an artist, but kind of like gave up on that and became a construction worker, which I always found like this correlation between like art and building. And then like, kind of kept going. Like my sister became an artist and then I did. It just like was this insane downward spiral, or maybe it was a good thing, who knows. But so growing up in the city was like just one of these very visually stimulating places that I think subconsciously, maybe growing up there, had like an influence on how I started to like approach my work. I'm definitely like getting into ceramics. When I was in high school, we had this like funky little ceramics studio that I was just like so obsessed with being in all the time. And wasn't really a great student, so I'd spend a lot of time just kind of like learning the wheel, learn how to hand build, spend all the time with this like my fantastic but like curmudgeon ceramics teacher in there. And I kind of started this first slide of like basically the bottom of this like lamppost on some sidewalk with this like crappy stencil of a teapot, which I just thought was like amazing. Just like one of these random examples of like how kind of like living in that area, even though making like ceramics in New York City kind of sucks because it's so densely packed and like it's just hard to find space to do things, and ceramics in a lot of cases requires a lot of space. So just like trying to like figure that out and navigate that and stay a ceramic artist and stay in New York City has been like kind of a challenge, but I think it's sort of like guided my work in a way that I've started to enjoy. And like for the most part, I started off as like a very traditional potter, made functional pots. This is just like an example of like one of this 50 mugs I made for this like online sale. And I just wanted to show it as like an example of, something a little bit, this is how I worked for the longest time. I learned like through the wheel. Started to expand a little bit more into like, taking these traditional pots, maybe making them a little bit more sculptural, whatever that means. Like I always felt like pottery was already so sculptural already, but just like adding things to it to make it, more animated, like elevated, doing whatever, adding feet, adding little appendages, not just like the cylinder with a little handle on the side. And so I'm just like, in this presentation I kind of slapped together, I just like have a couple little like images of like random inspiration, and maybe part of why, like, 'cause I will keep talking about like New York and like why I love it. And this was outside of this, actually, it was in Chinatown, and it was outside of this like Buddhist temple where they had this, they had these great sort of like screen doors that were falling apart, and everything was just like basically stitched back together with this like crappy plastic wire. And it was like this expansive, like it went around like the entire building. And it was just like kind of a great example of like, I don't know, I just became obsessed because I work near this building, so I walk by it every day. And just like how when like you see things like broken in like a really dense urban environment like New York, just like the way it gets repaired or the way it can like, I don't know, just like continue to exist without getting thrown out. It's like, it's good enough. Like it doesn't need to be perfect. And these next particular images were something that had like such a grasp on me. This was outside this deli in Bushwick that's in Brooklyn. And this was actually during the pandemic. I noticed this thing, and it was like this handle because they made it on their bench to basically like separate the bench in half. So it was like the kind of social distancing thing. And I just thought it was the most like fucking amazing like little, bricolage sculpture. Like with the guy who did it, he was like, we got a bunch of zip ties, we need to make a handle, so let's just like slap it together, throw it together. And it just turned out to be like this beautiful, like, I don't know, I'm just like, this particular object I'm like obsessed with. I have it on like my phone all the time. I had it as my background. I had it like, I printed it out. I want to put it on a t-shirt at some point, I don't know. It was just like such an influence for me. And I still don't even know why. I think just visually, I just like the way it looks. I like, what kind of like, it's just like, it reminds me of like the most pure form of like outside art, just like putting something together with what you have and maybe not even realizing like what you're making. And it turns out to be this kind of like beautiful object. And to take it kind of literally, I did end up like incorporating like different materials into like my sort of more traditional pottery, I guess. So this was part of a piece that was in this show that was a part of this gallery that my friend started called the U-Haul Gallery. And he did this whole like project where instead of like renting out a space, he rents a U-Haul gallery, and he like lines the U-Haul with white walls, and we were showing artwork in it. And because like the whole idea of it is that he can drive it and move it around, because in New York City, it's like you can't park anywhere without it like being illegal. But at the same time, no one really notices because it's so like there's so many people and so many things going on. So I kind of created this piece as like a way to like strap it down to the truck. Because this was in like, if you've ever rented like a U-Haul gallery, this was in like the grandma's attic. And I just wanted to like, kind of create this sort of concept of like sort of strapping the piece down. So if we had to like quickly move the truck around, it would kind of stay relatively in the same area, or like in the same space. It wouldn't like shift around or fall over. And then like the hanging kind of like porcelain mermaid kind of just reminded me of like some kind of, I don't know, just like a car decoration that you would have on like your dashboard or something. And then I saw like, this was just another example of like continuing to use like the zip ties and always something underneath to kind of like elevate the pots. I just thought this was kind of a funny picture. I teach at this studio called Greenwich House Pottery, and we do this like faculty show. And this was just a picture of it in the book, and I like how it just got cut right down the middle. I couldn't tell if that was like the worst place to have the image or like maybe the best place. But it all kind of started off like creating these like alternative motives of like, elevating the ceramic and elevating the piece. Like it kind of started in undergrad a little bit because, Alfred was great for ceramics, but I remember we had this like selection of the most beat up like white pedestals ever. And like, you either had to fix them or you just didn't want to use them. So we'd create like, or I started to create like different ways of like displaying work. And a lot of it started off like with just kind of wooden shelves, sometimes like more traditional tables. And the shelves in particular were like these enclosures. I actually don't have an image of any of them. I was like digging deep and I just couldn't find them. I think I have them on a flash drive back home. But I did start to notice that I started to make them because I wasn't super confident in the actual ceramic work at the time. So I would like create like, you know, so many things around it to like make it one singular piece, but it was never like focused that much on the ceramics. And this is just kind of like another random little blurb. One of my favorite objects ever. I forget the guy's name, but he was this really particular like Japanese like armor designer and maker. This one's like from the 1500s. I just think it's like so absurd. Like the appendages are so amazing. How most of it is like pretty symmetrical except for like this sort of like lobster claw, like kind of on the top. But I'm just finding myself like gaining inspiration from like sort of random objects like this. And like this was part of a big part of my practice that I'm starting to notice is teaching. Like I've been teaching for quite a while at these like random pottery schools. And what I've noticed about teaching and like demoing is that it does give you this freedom of like sort of like experimentation. So this was just like an example of, making a wheel thrown piece, darting and altering it with like a, heavy stoneware body, super, super groggy, and then like building a completely separate handle that was made out of like cone temp porcelain, and firing them separately, and then instead of like fusing them together, just like epoxying them together like afterwards. Because at this point I was like, why not? I'm not gonna run it through the dishwasher. It'll be kind of like fine as it is. And in a lot of cases, epoxy is a lot stronger than like a ceramic adhesion anyways. So it just got me kind of thinking in a different way, like, oh, maybe we don't always have to like use traditional ceramic techniques, or maybe we don't always have to use glaze. Maybe we can like make separate pieces out of like different clay bodies and, start using epoxy. And I just briefly, I kind of got inspired by like when Holly did her talk last week, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about like kind of the pandemic. So like over the pandemic, I like kind of really shifted what I ended up doing because I spent a lot of time upstate with my folks. And, I don't know if any of you ended up doing this, but like if you ended up staying with your family during the pandemic, it was intense. Like it was, I didn't spend time with them like that in 10 years. Like every single day, 24 hours a day, nobody was going to work. So like I kind of decided at a certain point after like, a level of frustration maybe with like my own family, and I was just gonna like go outside and like play with the mud. So I got really into like sort of like sourcing local clay and then building these mud kilns. Just like, I don't know, because in a weird way, I don't know if it's like okay to say, but I kind of loved the pandemic. It just like allotted me this time. I noticed that like for a lot of like creatives, we just like took the opportunity to like make things and maybe do things that we wouldn't have otherwise done. And like this was one of those things where I was like, I never would have done this if I didn't have that like 4 or 5 month period to kind of like experiment with like digging local clay. Because at the time, it didn't really feel like my thing. Like I was doing like cone 6, electric oxidation firing, and like with like light pastel colors and like really clean glazes. And I wanted to like kind of switch it up and just be like, let's get local mud, dig into the earth, get some clay, see what happens. And so the first kiln that I ended up building was like this bottle kiln, which are kind of awful. Like don't build bottle kilns. They fire really unevenly and they're like super hard to like get to high temperatures, but it was still great. It was kind of like the first test. So it was basically just like digging a hole in the ground, digging up mud, adding water, kind of mixing it together, and basically building it with like giant coils. And so that was firing it. I was using like an old piece of like iron from this fireplace kind of as the door. So I would just like kind of sketchily like pull it back, throw wood into it. I didn't have cones. I didn't have a barometer. I had no way of like gauging temperature except like kind of looking inside and just seeing what color, like if it was, dull orange or dull red. But it was a cool experience because, again, it got me out of like what I was doing, because I did feel like, not trapped, but I just felt like I, kind of wanted to do something different and a little bit more physical. And it turned out to be like really interesting because when you kind of make these kilns, especially when you form them by hand, like it's a little bit different than doing it with bricks because you are sort of like making these giant sculptures. And then when you fire, because they're all like unique and weird, and then after you fire them, they sort of, they bisque on the inside, because I think that's the highest temperature I got was like bisque temperature. And it sort of like solidified the entire form. So it would like kind of stand on its own. And this is just like a random kind of like construction view. Like I was using, like there was this big roll of like, this kind of metal mesh that was used for like laying concrete foundations. I think it was when like my parents were sort of like building the house. So I used it, covered it with like, you kind of score a little bit of cardboard, lay it on top, and then you can kind of build your arch. Cardboard builds out or burns out. But I don't know, it was an interesting project. These were some of the pots that came out of it. So this was some of like the local clay, which I thought was like, I actually kind of loved it. I was like, in the beginning, like it was horrible to work with. I was right by the Hudson River, which if you know like upstate New York at all, like the Hudson River is so nasty. So like whenever I was building with it, I was like always wearing gloves. I was always finding like shards of glass, and like I found a lot of oyster shells too, which I found out was because of this like yacht club down the river where they just like eat oysters all the time and just fucking throw them into the river. But it did turn out to be like this very beautiful like kind of terracotta color, and I won't get like too into it. Like I ended up finding like a few other clay bodies, like kind of just like drove around. That was sort of like my daily activities, like finding other places to source clay, and it was fun. Something that I've like really wanted to dive back into. And then this was like kind of at the end, it turned into like this sort of kiln yard. I ended up doing one more next to that, but I couldn't find a picture of it. I definitely should have documented it a little bit better. And then I actually, during this time, I was still teaching online classes and ended up doing like a kind of a short 6-week course on like how to build mud kilns. Even though I kind of had like no idea what I was doing. It was one of those things where it's like, you don't really have someone teach you. It's just like, you just got to do it and kind of see what happens. But that was super fun. Kind of like, again, sort of changed the like direction of maybe how I worked, or maybe just created like a different facet of possibilities. Because again, I had never made anything this big. And I think like, instead of making like a large sculpture and putting it into the kiln, just like fire the damn thing as a kiln, and that will be the sculpture. Now, of course, like they're made out of mud, so they are ephemeral, and they just sort of started to like deteriorate over time, which was kind of cool too, because they just sort of collapse like back into the ground. And you can just sort of, if you want to, just like kind of do it all over again. I haven't gotten that far yet. I still need to find the time. And towards the end, it really got like, grew this whole layer of moss on there. It kind of looked like a little hobbit house by the end. But so just a couple other snippets of like just random objects that I'm just like so sort of drawn to. Like these were actually at the Met, and they're like these ivory, they're these carved ivory feet for like, we don't know what type of furniture. They were either for like game boards or like the bottom of chairs, but just like, I don't know, I'm obsessed with like the curves, all the different like, all the different textures, where they're like straight lines at the bottom, these sort of natural curves on top. And even like the size of it, like it's this very small kind of compact object. It sort of reminds me of like a Ron Nagel. But just something like random objects that I'm just like so drawn to, and like I'm starting to like try to incorporate into my own work. So I started like experimenting and taking the idea of like these different pedestals and like taking it a little bit further. These were like, it was like a stack. I did it for this show in Soho, where like the bottom piece was like this wood out of this old kind of construction site. They were old beams, and it's like this really kind of, not sure what kind, I think it's pine, but like really, really old, kind of like sort of, it's like super soft, almost like kind of spongy in a way, like it's almost kind of rotten. But when you cut into it, you get these like beautiful sort of lines on the inside, and all those holes are where they like, you know, crappily hammered in these like rusty old nails. But just like using it as a way, instead of like how I used to work, like creating these enclosures around the ceramics, starting to elevate it a little bit more, and maybe starting to like exaggerate it. And then also getting into like just like different sort of found objects, again, sort of like this bricolage mindset, like find something that, like for example, these sort of spikes on the bottom are from these old, they're from broilers. They're like these broiler tiles that are like right underneath like the flame. I'm still not exactly sure how they're used. I've been like searching for these things like kind of like tenaciously, but I found them again on this like, I used to work on like a lot of construction sites when I was going through school and afterwards a little bit, and we just found it when we were gutting this kitchen like of this restaurant. And I was like, oh my God, those are such good objects. I don't know what I'm gonna use them for. But I just like packed them up. I found like 10 of them. And like, you know, years later, I ended up using them. I was like, oh my God, they'll make great stands. And then just getting into like, you know, creating, one thing I kind of got sick of with that last piece was just like using bricks. I kind of got tired of like using bricks as pedestals. I think I just maybe ended up doing it too much, or maybe I got bored by it, I'm not sure. But I started to just kind of like make my own, just out of like, you know, solid clay, which is like especially in New York, it's such like a taboo, like to just like fire solid clay. But I was like, you know, and we actually just did one right now, and it survived. It was like a 48-hour firing or something. And I was like, you know, it is possible. And I started thinking of these objects as, again, as like sculpture, like not necessarily something that, especially like, you know, the pedestal part, like not something you necessarily have to like run through the dishwasher. So this was me in my old studio in Red Hook. But at a certain point I was like, I'm not even gonna glaze these things. Like, I want like more of a contrast between like the ceramic and the pedestal, even if the bottom pedestal is ceramic. So instead of like putting a glaze on it that's gonna like, you know, match the surface of like the pot that it's on top of, like just started like spray painting things, experimented with like, you know, acrylics, spray paint, and then sort of like shellacking over it to kind of seal it. And just kind of got like more and more into that idea, and just like the contrast of like, you know, this surface that we can't necessarily always get with like glaze, like a traditional glaze. And then just sort of like a couple more pots, kind of like matching them together. And I'm kind of going through these slides a little blind. I'm not really sure what the next one is, but we'll kind of figure it out. But again, just like a couple more combinations, like, you know, old found, you know, terracotta tile. This one was like really just found objects. I actually did this really quick for a photo shoot, and it kind of totally changed the way I work. I just brought a bunch of random objects to my friend's basement, and I was like, I just need something to like put the pots on, and I was like, oh my God, like these could actually be like legitimate pieces. But again, like all about, you know, the focal point kind of being at the top, being like the, you know, the functional pottery or the non-functional pottery, but in general, like the time-consuming ceramic. And it, you know, it's just like a layer of like some marble tiles here, plywood. These were like these weird kind of plastic tiles that I found outside this like architecture firm that was throwing a bunch of stuff out. But those are cool objects. And then again, just like more of a combination of like, again, the old kiln bricks, which I'm gonna like start to phase out maybe a little bit more and more. And then just kind of getting into like, you know, pushing it a little bit further. Again, just sort of scavenging around New York, finding like good road crew construction sites and like seeing what's in their dumpsters. And I found this great one that just had like these sort of like broken pieces of stone. I think it's like a type of granite, I'm honestly not sure. And then again, just like having a little bit more fun with the photography, like kind of setting them up differently every time. Like in my apartment, I have this sort of mantle where I'll set up like 5 different pieces, and kind of just like throughout the week or like every week or every 2 weeks, I kind of just like rearrange them, disassemble them, and just like try different combinations. This was sort of like a different kind of variation of that against some old wood. That's honestly like unfired clay. I kind of cheated just for the photograph. But again, just sort of like leveling out this stone with the contrast of like this, you know, pink porcelain where I just like kind of wedged a bunch of stain into it. And just like a couple other sets, kind of more of that old wood. Getting a little bit more simple with the, or maybe not simple, I don't know if that's the right word, but just like a little bit more straightforward with the surfaces. Instead of doing like all the tape cut out and like having like the colors underneath and like the contrast of the glaze next to it, just like keeping them a little bit more simple, because I feel like as the pieces get more complex, it can be fun to play around like with complex pieces or complex forms and complex surfaces, but sometimes it's nice to do the opposite and just like have a complex form and then keep the surface really simple. That way the form can really like kind of come through. And I spent a little bit of time in India over the past, this past February into March. And one thing I noticed, like, I think I subconsciously got like super inspired by were like all these different sort of like altars and shrines that you just find everywhere. I just love like, I don't know, the setup, the proportions of them, how like, you know, they would decide, you know, whoever set them up, like where they would decide to put their sort of like bed of flowers, and then like the empty bowl, and then the candles, and the dog, and the offering up here, and then like the deity in here. And they always just kind of read to me as like, I don't know, very sculptural and almost kind of like painter-like, because they are like, they're all very like boxy and kind of like, I don't know, very sort of controlled and compact. And I always really loved that. It was like compacting so much information into like one little box, and so much like visual stimulation. And again, like, I don't know, contrasting surfaces, like the mirrors here, the kind of old Ganesh in the middle, and like the crazy enamel eyes that are kind of glued onto there, and then like the flowers that are sort of like wilting and dying. So it's like a combination of like the ephemeral and the permanent. But so I kind of like, I don't know, got more into that like sort of contrast of, you know, using some of those same materials, taking it like a little bit of a step further. Something I've been like so obsessed with over the past like 6 months are these like bird spikes, because you see them everywhere in New York. And it's basically, you know, you put them on like, you know, little like, you know, ridges on like your building so like birds don't nest in them. And I've been like obsessed with kind of like finding them, and I just buy them because they're so cheap. They come in like these big rolls. They're like these, they're like these super intimidating objects, because it's like unrolling like a bandsaw blade. Like it's just like all these different teeth. You get really cut up if you're not wearing gloves. And just kind of, again, like creating layers. So contrasting it with the wood and having them stand, you know, upside down, having them stand right side up, having a different type of wood here, and then like the plastic bird spikes in between, and then realizing that they do start to become kind of shrine-like, because again, at the top is always like the ceramic piece. It's always like what we're trying to embellish at the end. And just like, some of these are still like kind of experiments. Like, I'm not sure where I want to go with them, but it's kind of how I think I enjoy to work, is just like, you know, try a style and then just try a bunch of different variations. So this would be an example of like something I would play around with on my mantle. Like I would just kind of like look at it when I come home from work and decide like, ooh, maybe I actually want the spikes to be upwards, or maybe I want them to be down, and like act as feet, and then like, you know, use the like ceramic brick or pedestal, whatever we want to call it, sort of as like the top point, and of course like kind of the pot on top. And then just like a couple more variations. And I do realize like, I am kind of, it is sort of like not every piece is permanent. Like they can constantly change. And I'm sort of like, I'm still trying to figure that out, because I do really love that. I love the idea of like incorporating like more photography, like make things impermanent and like always change them. And it kind of like leads to new ideas. And then these were just like a couple of these, I don't know, the last pieces I made, where it's like, you know, I wanted something that kind of like either went around the ceramic or like went behind it, but could kind of hold its shape up. And I love how these like really common, like, I don't know, sort of menacing, like bird spike objects, like when like put into like, you know, an arch or put into a circle, kind of look like crowns, or they kind of look like, you know, like St. Mary or something, like a halo behind it, or even like, I don't know, crown of thorns, something like that. But again, just really focusing, I guess, on like building up different layers. So like the softwood here, kind of the plastic crappy bird spikes down here, and then just building up higher and higher until it comes into this sort of like, I don't know, I guess more like glorious presentation. And I'm still like kind of working on titles. Like I've been sort of contrasting them with like sort of like cute like couple pet names, just to like, I don't know, I guess contrast piece. Like this one was called Lovey, this one was called Sugar Plum. Because I just thought like, and it was sort of like, you know, sometimes we make decisions like very sporadically. Like we're just like, oh, I don't know it. Like, let's just call it whatever. Let's call it like what it's not. Let's call it, I don't know, because names are tricky. Like I always want to, you know, part of me wants to be like, ah, fuck it. Like, let's just call it Untitled. But then part of me is like, no, let's have like a little bit of fun with it. Let's like at least throw some kind of name in there, and then it starts to create like some kind of conversation. And then I think I have one more. Oh yeah, it was just like one more slide of like this sort of like one of the last greenware pieces I made before like coming here, and sort of noticing I was working, you know, sometimes in New York, depending on where you're making work, you kind of just have to make do with what you have. It's not always the same. We can't have like, it's hard to have like a garage studio in New York, for example. So like, this was actually at one of the studios that I teach at. And it was sort of like a continuation of like a demo, and I was like, oh, I actually want to turn this into a piece. And then again, sort of photographing it just sort of like not super well on my iPhone. I noticed like, you know, it's kind of looks like another shrine, even with all like the random crap in the background, because it was like in the back mixing room where we mix all the glazes. But just sort of thinking about that, like kind of how to elevate the ceramic and how like, I don't know, create these like more unique ways of presentation instead of just like displaying them. Have the display like become something. Have the display like be part of the piece, and then like as a whole they become like a singular sculpture, I guess. Yeah, that's kind of all I got. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Luke. Then it's a pleasure to introduce Lane Preston. Lane Preston, originally from Houston, Texas, received his BFA from the School of Art Institute of Chicago with an emphasis in photography and sculpture in 2016. After graduation, he worked as an exhibitions coordinator and photographer for art and design galleries to put on exhibitions all over the world. In 2021, he went to Florence, Italy for his MFA in furniture, fabrication, and design after teaching abroad for 2 years. Please welcome Lane.
All right. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet y'all. I do my best to avoid this, so if I'm nervous and what may have you, that's why. I've taught children, and children are less intimidating than this. But like Joanne said, I got my degree in photography and sculpture. Unlike Luke, my family is not an art family. There's not a lick of art in there, so me going to art school kind of was an anomaly. So why would you do that? And a big part of why I wanted to do art was largely because it was a way that I was able to communicate that felt more effective than words. I was able to speak with materials and images that felt more genuine and more effective than talking. But to give some kind of structure, essentially we're gonna start at the turning point. I went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where essentially you can kind of do whatever you want as long as you hit that credit necessity. but I focused on photography and sculpture, largely sculpture, during my undergrad. And as I was coming to the end of my sculpture program, some questions popped up with regards to relationships, be that the relationship of your work with the audience, the relationship of your work with where does it live, how does it live, what do you hope that interaction with the audience is like, and how am I actually engaging with them? And at that time, I was putting objects together, and I was using the language of like art with a capital A, where it was pretty academic references, insular references. It felt really opaque when I began to really look at it. And as I was doing that, it was a language that I essentially had gotten and learned only in art school. And I realized that I wasn't really connecting with people like I wanted to. I wasn't speaking frankly. And so it put me at a point to where I started to think about how am I actually connecting with people. So being the art student, I was pensively sitting in my studio, scratching my head, trying to think about what is art, how do I understand art, and I wasn't really getting anywhere until I began to think about the interaction between the maker and the artist, like Wile E. Coyote. And it wasn't until I started to think about the interaction between the maker and the artist as Wile E. Coyote, in the sense that we present something to the audience, they're able to enter into it, and on one hand, we want to be able to enter into it similarly, but at times we're rejected by it. And it's in that dynamic of like being able to enter into something. And it was thinking about the viewer and the maker interchangeably in those characters, because either one could be Wile E. Coyote, who is able to illustrate and create this idea and this reality that allows others to go into it, and the other one could be the Roadrunner. But with this thought, it kind of gave me an idea of like, how do I actually want to engage with people? And I realized that I wanted a hybrid. I didn't want to really reject people. I wanted to have a balance between being able to make this reality that people want to engage in and can engage in, and also having the ability to suspend disbelief and fully immerse myself into this thing. And I realized that with the work I was making in my sculpture practice, I wasn't doing it. Even in my attempt at extending an invitation into reading, it became illegible. This was essentially a sculpture that I had in, I think, my last critique in undergrad. And I was like, I'm gonna give them the key. I'm gonna write out everything so that they're able to read. And then I put the reflective mylar on top and just rejected them. And then what my key is held up on is fake. It's Play-Doh that's acting like tape. And so essentially this all was just a simulacrum. It was a simulation of what a generous gesture could be. So, I guess I took that out. So essentially, I realized that I wasn't speaking in a language I wanted to, so I switched back to my photographic practice where I thought I also was collaborating. I thought I was also engaging and being generous, and my collaboration was with my subject. I'd walk up, we'd have conversations. I was shooting exclusively on film just because that's how you got the reel. And even in these conversations, I wasn't actually collaborating. I was setting up scenarios and setting up scenes that allowed me to create these images and to create these narratives, but I was actually engaging with that person. The printed object had no relationship with them. And so at times it felt more like I was doing wildlife photography and just setting a trap so that I could get that thing, and same with the sculpture. All right, so I realized something needed to change. I realized I needed to adjust something. I had to have some internal reflection. So what was I gonna do about it? And I realized I still wanted to work sculpturally. I still wanted some tangible idea of like, does this thing work? And I wanted essentially to be able to make a thing that had both sides, the simplicity so that I could show it to my grandmother. She understood what I was making and she was like, oh, that's cool. And so that I could show it to my friends who are also in the field and we can dive into those details. And what I kind of came up with was furniture. This was my first chair that I made in my Chicago apartment. I had no idea what I was doing. I was essentially reading books from the library, looking at YouTube videos, and I would try a thing. If it worked, great. If it didn't, I would then try to figure out how to respond to that and fix that. And part of the joy of this was there were mistakes that I made, there were mistakes that the material made, and essentially it just constantly encouraged and challenged me to problem solve and assess and reassess. And the nice thing is, there's a pretty clear indicator if you've made the chair right. You sit in it, it doesn't break, great, you're good. But I called it Bam because it was the first chair I had made, and I was starting to get my legs. And it felt right. There's something about wood that it has the ability to be poetic, and when you turn it and pair it with furniture, it has the ability to be intrinsically functional. And in its function, it needs you to listen to it. It needs you to talk to it and to collaborate with it. And these are the two first pieces of furniture I ever made. And as I was making them, again, I'm listening to the material, trying to address cracks and trying to adjust spans and prevent its early demise because it wants to separate, because wood has a will of its own, it has a life of its own. And there is something really beautiful about coming to wood as a material paired with furniture that encouraged me to keep going. But I come from a school of concept. How do we make meaning out of this thing? It's just function. It's just a thing. When in reality, that's not. My approach with wood is that it was a living being before me. It had a life before me. It had a history that, if I'm being considerate, I'm going to acknowledge. If I'm being charitable, I'm going to work with that material to maintain its history and its uniqueness while being kind of pushy, making it do what I would like it to do. But also I figured out that making meaning out of my work came from making it with people in mind, its function in mind, where it lives. As you can see, a lot of my furniture exists, or I document it outside, because where should it live? I don't want it to live in a white cube or a white space, because that kind of detracts from the possibility of what it could be and how it could live. But also, as much as who I am making this piece for informs its form and shape, where it could live could also inform its shape. In this, essentially, I had a friend who liked to crouch in chairs. That simple. Made it deep so that they could perch on the chair. And I spend a lot of time trying to address the unique qualities of material that has been deemed unusable or trash or has been discarded. It also kind of gave me the ability to focus on surface, which I often will do in these inlays. But yeah. Another challenge that will come up with the material is that sometimes the material is a jerk. Sometimes the material doesn't want to do the thing, and you have to figure out how to do the thing, and sometimes the thing is just being strong enough to sit. And I've really appreciated that in the sense that it gives me the ability to try and problem solve and think creatively about how does this seat rest, and how does it actually elevate, and how do we accommodate for the life that this material has led. And as previously mentioned, making stuff for people has been pretty critical to how I make and why I make. I'm going to butcher this, and I'm really sorry. Stephanothoki is a case used for holding crowns. In a Greek Orthodox wedding, the man and the wife exchanged crowns, and a friend of mine had asked me to make this essentially reliquary for them. And in doing so, my skills have gotten better, my tact, my taste has gotten better, but I was then starting to bring in a specificity of material towards the person. The person I was making this for was an old studio mate, and so I used their favorite wood as well as cypress from Greece. And beginning to add specificity to that, to add meaning to the work that I'm making, was something that I was beginning to explore and beginning to really enjoy. also making oddities and making things that are unique to the strangeness of the people that I'm making stuff for. The Witch's Head box was made for a friend who they're a fantastic designer. They make beautiful clothes and drag designs that have been seen all over the place, but they have a life and a vibrancy and to a degree an absurdity that when they asked for a box or an exchange of gifts more specifically, I tried to figure out what would be the best guardian for your oddities. And that's how we got into this. On the interior, the witch, you can store whatever you want to hide inside the witch's mouth, and it's just a very unsettling thing to walk into at night. So time to do the things we hate. I hate computer work like most makers do, but I realized that I was going to be limited by my understanding in the language. So I also wanted to have a pretty sustainable practice, which is why I went to the school that I did. And that's where I began to learn Rhino and rendering and doing technical drawings and figuring out how to talk with manufacturers and essentially how to incorporate the efficiency of design into the practice that I already had and figuring out how to dream outside of the forms that I already was doing. But that program was super helpful because it was also just a very good set of skills for me to apply to a sustainable and maintainable practice as somebody who wants to make furniture. So back to making, applying what I knew. I hadn't made a body of work yet. I hadn't made a collection, and so I was commissioned to make this table for a couple that lives in the UK, and it had to be able to be flat packed, it had to be able to be reassembled, it had to be able to stay stable in a significantly drier climate than Houston. And so applying those design skills, applying the efficiency became really critical, as well as the idea of if you're going to make a thing, you might as well make a family. Because the reality of furniture is not everybody needs a table. If you do your job right, you make one table once and then they're set. So trying to think also about what are other methods of making your work accessible, be that small side tables, stools, vases, decorations, and what may have you. It pushed me to try and think about working as a full breadth for a full home instead of simply going project to project, instead of thinking as an artist making furniture and more of a designer artist making furniture. We're coming close to the end. This is a more recent work, still focusing on surface, still focusing on the ornamentation of surface while maintaining the history and the legacy of what that wood was, while giving it a more sleek and efficient methodology of making and of shipping. These legs have the ability to detach. It's able to be flat packed, which as I'm continuing to make becomes more and more important because sending 60 pounds in a 5 foot by 5 foot box is just not sustainable. And then finally, one of the more recent pieces where again exploring surface and still trying to maintain a sculptural point and keeping the efficiency of design in mind. But yeah.
All right. Thank you, Lane. So we have 10 minutes of question. If you have any questions, just let me know. I could bring a microphone to you.
Thank you.
Hey, I have thanks for the talks. They were great. I want to ask both of you a question, but they're different questions. So I'm going to start with Luke. Luke, Betsy here. Hi. So I wanted to ask you about your teapots because you're focusing on these forms. And one thing that I noticed when I was looking at your work tonight and you were talking about it, you have these elevated teapots and sometimes there are two teapots, and sometimes they seem to be in conversation. And I'm curious about whether or not you're thinking about that when you're making them, because they seem to be in a relationship or struggle sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like, definitely, I don't know if it's like the form really, but it's more like the shape of the spout always seems to, like, depending on how I make them, like maybe one will stick out really far, maybe the other one will kind of like retract a little bit. And just like, when you see that, you're like, oh, cool, maybe those can like fit together kind of like a puzzle piece or something. And especially as like the spouts got maybe more and more expressive, like maybe like, I wasn't really thinking about function anymore. I always thought like I love teapots so much, but I always felt like the tea bag kind of killed the teapot. So it's like become this sort of, not necessarily like extinct like pottery form, but just we don't use it as much. Not saying we shouldn't. Like if you have a teapot in your house, you'll find a reason to use it. You'll end up making like ginger turmeric tea with like, raw root that you got from the grocery store, and your throat feels better, you get sick less. Like, I don't know. But I think as the spouts, like as I started caring maybe less and less about the functionality about them and more just like the form and visually how they looked, they started to like really have these interactions with each other. And I kind of based them off, not really based them off, but like subconsciously got inspired by these old kung fu movies I used to watch as a kid, called like they're called Shaw Brothers, and you guys should all look them up. And they would always just have like these ridiculous ways of like, kind of combating each other, and the hand forms were always like so insane and like over the top. And I always tried to like find like some kind of like animated way of creating the spouts and having them interact in a way where maybe they're not fighting, but they're like, shaking hands, or they're dancing, or maybe they are fighting, I don't know. But yeah.
All right, thank you. Lane, so I wanted to know a little bit more about the types of wood that you're putting together. As a designer, you're thinking about how something looks and functions, but you're also, you explained, very concerned with the meaning of things. So I'm wondering what, for you, is there a narrative in using those different kinds of woods together? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Often it'll start with a desire to take something that was cast aside. I mean, it's taking something that has been deemed as unusable or not wanted and trying to figure out a way to work with it so that it can be functional again, and so that it's not just cast. This material was a part of a tree that had been growing for at least 100 years, and it had a life and it had experiences. And so trying to really utilize all of it and trying to give an appreciation to what it is, even in its decrepit state, is really important to me. And often the other woods that I'm using to inlay and to stabilize on a very pragmatic point are just stable, steady woods that allow us to like use this essentially trash wood. But it's also very much image based. It's figuring out a composition for the pattern and for the inlay. But yeah.
Any other questions? Great.
Thank you both for your talk. You both using found objects in your work. Why do you find yourself drawn to using these materials and uplifting something that was then discarded? You can both answer.
Yeah, I think it started off as something like really simple, just like, oh, like that looks cool. Like and then sometimes I wouldn't know what the hell to do with it, but like I want to eventually figure out a way how to incorporate that into the work. And like ceramics is like, you can do so many things with ceramics, but sometimes incorporating other materials into it, it doesn't always work. It doesn't really make sense. It's hard to fit things together. Like if you wanted to stick a piece of wood into some clay, you know, maybe it would shrink and you couldn't actually like adhere them together. It wouldn't fit. So it's like, maybe, I think I just started like, you know, again, being in New York and kind of constantly being around these like incredible like dumpster diving opportunities and just like finding these like random objects. And like, again, just being drawn to them. Sometimes I don't even know why. It's kind of like those like furniture legs. Like I saw them in a museum and I was like so drawn to them. I don't know why. And I think I do the same thing with like found objects. I'll just see it. I'll be like, oh, I got to use it for something. And then it turned into just like, you know, put the pots on it. Like just like put it on something that's not just like, you know, a white background or a white pedestal. Put it on something a little bit more, something that's a little more personal to you, something that like inspires you and maybe even inspired like what you put on top of it. Yeah.
Because wood is expensive. It 100% started off like that, and also being like, I can buy these scraps and I can get them more affordably that way. But also, realistically, nature's such a better designer than I ever will be. Like, it's able to create forms and structures that are engaging, and when you're limiting yourself to the oddity and the strange, and you still have to achieve that thing, it gives you some design constraints that make choice making easier. You're just like, oh, I've got to do this. How do you let me do this? And also sometimes it's just cool. Like sometimes you're just like, yeah, that's awesome.
Any other question? Okay.
Hi guys, thank you so much for your speeches. Question for both of you, a little oddball. Would you rather your viewer like use your work until it is like broken and worn down, or would you rather them like leave it on a shrine forever and not touch it?
I don't know. I think it depends. Like, I think, like, definitely part of it, like a shrine. Like, you know, set it up in maybe the particular way I set it up and just leave it like that forever. But then then my ADHD kind of kicks in, and like maybe I'll see it 5 years later in that person's house, and I'm like, you haven't done anything with this? Like, you haven't rearranged it? Like, do something different with it. So I think like kind of a combination with both, and especially like the utilitarian stuff. I mean, like use it to death. But yeah, that's a good question. I love that.
I do know. Use it to death. This stuff was already made. It's been loved and cared for in terms of how it was made. And for you to not use it is kind of sad. And yeah, like that, the furniture in itself can be the base of the shrine or like the base of the home. So use it to create the space that you want and use it as functionally with whatever that may mean for you as that is.
All right, that's last question.
Thank you. I enjoyed both your talks, and I have different questions for both of you. I'll start with Luke. Have you considered I really like the found objects in your pedestals, and the teapot the shape is fantastic and it makes sense, all your iterations. But going back to New York City, I lived in New York in the early 2000s, and a graffiti artist named Swoon was doing these beautiful paper cuts, and they're almost like shrine-like.
I love Swoon.
Yeah, Swoon's amazing. But then I was also really inspired by Rolando, who did these spinning pinwheels out of tops of detergent bottles and tin cans, and their fences around like the 9th Street Community Garden in the Lower East Side. I would love to see your teapot maybe like cemented up high somewhere and kind of like a surprise. But if you thought about public art or like kind of, you know, a hidden in plain sight opportunity in New York City, I think the teapot would be really striking.
Yeah. I'm not sure who was that person you named who made that fence?
Rolando.
Rwanda? Because
He's
I
a-
think I've definitely seen that. I grew up in the East Village, and like kind of the East Village kind of turned into like sort of this insane like rich sort of frat house community, unfortunately. But it used to be very like art based, and there were all these great like I remember, and they tore a lot of them down, but I remember these like insane fences. Like, again, made out of like scrap metal, and someone just went out there with a welder and just like tacked a bunch of things together, and still very well thought out. And there were all those like, do you remember like around a lot of the lampposts, there were like these kind of like mosaics that people would do with like broken shards of mirror, broken shards of tile, and yeah, definitely. I thought about it like, even, because this is the first time I've been to Anderson Ranch in 10 years, and I totally forgot about the wall by like the Soldner building with all like, whenever they like poured the concrete for it, they just jammed a bunch of like random pots in there, like not things that are necessarily tiles. But yeah, I would love to do something like that, and just to see how it would like, I don't know, like visually how it would stand in that context, and then just see how it would like kind of fare the weather conditions and see how it like deteriorate over time, and then having it be like kind of maybe part of like a bigger thing like a building or something, and have it just as like a side little decoration. Yeah, I would love to do something like that. Absolutely.
The urban patina would be great.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe
so-
even like the pollution and like
Yeah.
the discoloring. I would love to do something in the subway. There's this great like Tom Modernist kind of installation at this 14th Street subway, and you see how like the brass has just like sort of deteriorated over time from people like touching it and just being in this like crazy, smoggy, polluted atmosphere, which is like nasty but kind of beautiful at the same time. But yeah, definitely, absolutely.
Thanks. I'll throw one more in for Lane. I'm curious how your practice has evolved here this summer at Anderson Ranch, and I really like seeing the metal starting to come into your woodwork. So could you maybe explain a little bit how that process is going this summer?
Yes. Pretty similar to what Luke was saying, where it's like, it feels kind of hard to incorporate materials into ceramics. For me, it kind of feels hard to incorporate other materials into wood in a more seamless way, in a way that materially makes sense. And that example of like the brass punching through the cherry was probably one of the first ways, but I'm actually trying to work with William, who's the sculpture coordinator, and figuring out a joinery system using cast bronze pieces so that we can begin to assemble and assemblage multiple materials outside of just wood, because it's also one where intrinsically you're like, furniture's not just wood. How do we expand it? And so right now I'm working with William to figure out some satisfying and fun ways to do that.
Great. Thank you, both of you. And